We're being joined by the filmmakers of Power Station and Anastasia Reverie. So we have Andrea, and we've got Daniel over here, two incredible people. I'm just gonna do the boring bit, read out their bios, just share a little bit about them. So Dan is an experienced film editor, director and producer with multiple commissions for Channel 4. His first film, How to Re-Establish a Vodka Empire, was critically acclaimed and opened at the BFI London Film Festival before being released across the UK and US. And also we have the amazing bank job, which is something I think definitely to celebrate. So that's that bio done. If you want me to add anything else from your autobiography, no? Okay. Okay, and then we've got Andrea Zimmerman. Is a German award-winning artist, filmmaker, and cultural activist whose multi-layered practice calls for a profound reimagining of the relationship between people, place, and ecology. Her film, Estate a Reverie, is a spirited celebration of everyday, extraordinary humanity. Filmed over 7 years, the film looks at the resilience of the residents who are profoundly overlooked and stereotyped by media and wider representations. Estate a Reverie asks how we might resist being framed exclusively through class, gender, ability, or disability, and even through geography. I just wanted to share a few things about the connection between the films. So the two films, I think what this exhibition is what is to what if and so what, and we're kind of looking at what neighborhood scale transition can be. And we just thought it was a beautiful way to end this with two incredible depictions of what happens when a street comes together either to make a power station. It shows that cumulative power of creating connected networks of people that can envision a future beyond. And I just thought that was really beautiful. And then Andrea's film looks at the incredible power of people even within times of crisis and how they can still come together, see what's beautiful, capture that, and use that as a springboard to continue reimagining and moving forward. So I think that this panel is going to be shaped around, this conversation is going to be shaped around what neighborhood transitions can look like and how we can create that cumulative network to continue doing that and moving forward. I actually didn't have questions, so I've stolen questions from around the room. So you might have seen some of these, but I think I'm going to start. Actually, let me just start. Do you want to say anything about yourselves and about how you're feeling before we go into the questions? No? Okay, that's fine. So the first question is, what if we make the transition irresistible? And I think that's interesting because these films, for me, they make it irresistible. They show me that we can do this. And I just wanted to hear your reflections on this what if question. And I think it's an interesting question because you've moved beyond the what if and you've gone into the so what. So, yeah.
Should I just use this one? Hello? So the question is, what if we make it irresistible, the transition? What if we make it irresistible? Well, basically, I just think there's no choice that we just have to do it. It's not really it's not like, I just feel that the urgency is so intense and that there's just such a lack of impetus going on, from above. So really, it feels to me, I feel an irresistible desire to just throw everything at some form of action that offers some hope, because I think if we don't have that, if we were to seal ourselves off from that hope, which is actually the end of your film, it talks about hope. I have to have that because otherwise I'll feel like I haven't got the power to actually, to wake up the next day and to get on with things, unless I can have some form of optimism that we can build a more just and ecological world, but not in the far-off future, but literally, day by day. So I think often, we get these questions about, solar punk, and we look at all that aesthetic a lot, and my only critique of it, it seems to contain so many good ideas, but my critique of it often is that it's always this far-off imagined world, Whereas, like, we don't have the time for that, you know. And also, there's no anger in it as well. I think you have to locate the anger to give you the fuel to get through as well. So, I just think that I just need it in a way. I need to have that belief that we can create something better.
I agree. And I think that the future is already irresistible. It is already irresistible, and people in estate, for example, the people who I lived amongst for 18 years and I still live with in the newly built housing, already want this future, and we wanted this future all the time, but we weren't listened to. And that goes from people also, you know, who were much, much, much older, and people who had very little, and some people had much more, and they also were already practicing the future. But the cultural narratives that exist, the prevailing cultural narratives that are often so politicized, they don't acknowledge that fact that most people already are in it and want it. So the kind of non-possibility almost is created also through the cultural imaginary, I think, and the narratives that persist. And therefore these kind of actions, even like you sleeping on the roof, and I was following it also like at the coldest time of the year, and I was like, oh my God. These are all like reframing, I think, these kind of imaginaries and the ideas that we actually, the more of this kind of dreaming of new futures, but also with evidence of its making, like these things are dreamed into being literally. Therefore they can't be erased, they can't be forgotten, they can't be denied.
I think that's what I think is really beautiful about that, is that our work at Civic Square is moving in the direction of creating demonstrators, because we think that you can dream, you can imagine, you can live far away in the future, but what about the now? And so we've shifted to creating concrete, solid, worked out, transformative demonstrators that people can then go ahead and recreate and reimagine within their own context. So, I mean, I think the next thing that I want to move on to is, because I think there's this thing of moving away from individual despair into collective hope and movement building, and this becoming an essential part of the neighborhood, and thinking about scale, because we can look at that larger scale, that political scale, the planetary scale, but then there is a scale that is right on our doorstep. There's the home and the street. And I think it's really beautiful that you bring that into conversation with people through the film and actually through the physical work that you're doing. I just wanted to hear more about why you've approached at this scale. Yeah.
I mean, the reason why I'm putting it to Dan, because yours is the most current, and it's so alive, and it's so inspirational, because it's so alive. So I'm gonna say something after you.
Thanks, Andrea. I can't actually remember what the question was, but about scale, and how do we scale it up, and about how do we build something as a movement.
Movement, and why are you focused on the street scale? Yeah,
the street is always, for us, it's critical that it's a kind of metaphor, because if it's just a few solar panels going up, that lacks any power in a way. So we're continually looking at how do we scale up a kind of street by street model that takes place, you know, despite the prevailing status quo, if you like. Talking a little bit, I'm not sure if we were talking about infrastructure, but that to me is really important, because what we're doing is infrastructure on one level, which is physical, technological infrastructure going onto the top of houses and looking at kind of like retrofit ideas and stuff. But the more important for us is about the infrastructure of the imagination, basically, about what do you think is possible to create, and then trying to prove that out. So it's taking a vision and then taking it in a micro scale that you can actually just about pull off if you're ambitious and sort of relentless about how you do it. And then challenging and hoping to create like a series of relatively simple steps, hopefully that other people can follow, and then working out what are the obstacles that other people face, and trying to come up with solutions that they can, you know, that they can take to scale those obstacles for themselves in a way. So what we're doing is we're throwing ourselves into a problem, which is how do we do this, like to create lots of, like turn our street into a power station, throw yourself into that idea, encounter lots of obstacles, which as filmmakers we have a kind of perverse love of obstacles because they make a good story, and then try and get out of this horrible situation that you've put yourself in bit by bit. And then in the process of extricating yourself from that problem, record it, which is the film, and then share it, and then hopefully that becomes a useful method for others.
And having grown up and living and making this film on a council estate and coming from a sub-working class background, often I've come to know that some of the solutions, like when we talk about sustainability, retrofitting, fixing instead of throwaway, recycling, upscaling, these are all practices I grew up with and that were practiced on my estate, and they also feature in the estate film. And it's like when we actually open our eyes properly, we see something that we pretend doesn't exist. So it's also really about really properly looking, learning to look in a way. That's for me also the hope, because the solutions are also coming, but they're also already there. There's a partnership. And the kind of structures of erasure and denying these kind of narratives to even live. And when we, for example, in our estate, we wanted to have an A+ energy efficiency. And we had an amazing campaign for all sorts of things that we weren't successful. We were successful in some of the campaigns, but not in all of them. And it just shows you like the amount of work we have to do together and all sorts of different structures to make people in the positions of power with the finance, in decision making. It's also us, enabling these people to make these decisions. So how can we intervene in that process? We need each other to make that change. And it's also about community, and the community as a larger idea of it, not necessarily a community that's exclusive, you're in, you're out, but as a community of difference that is truly productive and really reframing the way in which we see how the world is made. And that gives me hope, actually, more.
I really quite liked the infrastructures of imagination. And then another thing, I think, when we kind of bring this conversation to the table for many, they have reservations about how you create that. How do you bring people together? What are the key things that you've had to embody to bring people into this collective sort of space of action and seeing themselves as a connected network or community or neighborhood?
The thing that really strikes me as the most important thing is just being willing to fail with all this stuff, because we don't really know any of these answers. That's a great question, but it's not like we went away to work out how can we create this big community and everything. It was just like there was a WhatsApp group because it was lockdown, and we came out with the idea of, we knew about the connection between like the private banking system and the climate crisis, and most banks were creating interest-bearing loans just to fuel into the kind of property market and that type of thing, rather than looking at lending to projects which were actually revolutionizing how energy was used or greening the planet, and if it wasn't deemed profitable enough, a bank wouldn't lend, all that. So we knew that was a problem. So we came out with the idea of, let's turn like Walthamstow into a renewable power station. And then it was like, well, that's really quite a big step, because there's like 400,000 houses there. So not 400,000 houses, about 400,000 to 500,000 people there. So we thought, well, let's just scale it to the street, ideally. And even that's then ended up being a big challenge. But it's having that kind of, that idea, that kind of, kind of like that end goal, if you like. And then what we did was we just took that vision and then we just popped it onto the WhatsApp group, and we're like, anyone up for this? We'll sell artworks and try and buy everyone's solar panels. And then there was just this like long pause on the WhatsApp group, Because usually people were used to, you know, has anyone got a spare, you know, has anyone got any eggs? Or I don't know, you know, those type of questions. This one was a bigger question, and it just landed badly on the WhatsApp. So then what we did was a few people were keen on it, like the people that we knew closely. So what we did was we would like group up with them, and then we'd walk up and down the street, like trying to get more people into it. And then bit by bit, there's still a lot of doors being slammed in our faces. And, you know, each project that you do, you think a commissioning person with money will like know that you actually can finish a project, but they never do. They always think the next thing is never going to work. So, you know, we went through the same process of doors being slammed in our face on multiple different levels. And then just bit by bit, you just find a core of people who do like the project, believe it can work, and then they sort of enter into they become part of the community, whether it be on the street or online, or if it's a community of funders or whatever it might be. Just the people who effectively are like, you know, who really feel a connection to that idea. And I think the willingness to basically, for the lead balloon to descend, the ability to make a fool of yourself in public and to fail multiple times, for me, that's the first step on how to build a movement, really, because unless you're willing to take a bit of a risk with any of these things, I think it will be really hard.
And I think for us on the estate, it was the images which we put on the wall in the facade of the building, because when the council put all across Hackney in buildings that were deemed not fit for fixing them to the decent home standard, which was called in 2010. So they put up these orange boards prior to that, evicting people literally, you know, at last minute. So we had like a huge campaign. I think this is quite important to also understand. Then we tried to preserve these places. There were short life housing tenants also within our building. But they had been there for sometimes longer than I was there, who was a legal tenant. None of us knew what the status of each of the tenants. It wasn't a question. We were living there. And then when we found out, these people are being evicted, so we had a campaign. So the first campaign we won, the second campaign they literally put people out and poured cement down all the pipes, which meant that these flats could never be opened up again. And if you think about, these flats belong to all of us because they're taxpayers' money that pays for it, because it's called public housing. So there was actually criminal damage done to every single person in the UK, never mind the lives which had to move on into another kind of precarious living situation. And then, as one of our coming together, we were like, we have to intervene in this somehow. And then we changed the orange boards, putting these big faces up on the facade. And through that, we had like one of the flats which we, just on the other side of the estate, which had a different, anyway, we could use this flat to take the photographs for this project. And we thought, it's going to take maybe a month. And then literally we took 2 days to do this project because people brought their neighbors. Everybody understood what that potentially meant. And that brought us together. And so it was through a shared experience that we could start this really big campaign to prevent people from being moved far away in the what's called regeneration process, which sometimes means people are moved out into a completely different city or town and losing the whole network of connections. And that was a really important thing, because I think, lastly, I want to just also say that it's not always artists who bring in creative aspects into a community. It's also about how do we allow people to flourish and thrive with their imaginations, because everybody brought so many ideas, and you can see them in the film, and suddenly people would propose you know, they wanted to do gardening projects. They wanted to, like, many different things. We had like a living garden project for quite a few years. And everything is possible if the pressure is taken away from, you're going to lose your place where you live, or you're struggling to survive, or whatever. If there's enough support somehow, then things are possible. So I think it's also about like really thinking through, like, what environments are we creating for people? What is a livable environment for people to have different kind of ideas of what it means to live and to be sustainable?
I think that comes back to your point about recognizing that what what is in your community, what is in your neighborhood, and recognizing that, honoring that, and bringing that to, and creating an environment where they can bring that to the table. And then once that's all on the table, looking and seeing, okay, what can we do now with that? What can we imagine, and where can we go? And I think that was a beautiful thing in the film, because you could see that you weren't telling your story alone, you were telling the story of that neighborhood, which was something that's always struck me, and it really impacted even the way that I kind of approach sharing and telling stories. And I think that was what was quite incredible. And I'm imagining, Dan, that in your process as you're going along, you will start looking and seeing, okay, what is there? What are the things that we can motivate people through that matters to them? And I'm guessing as you start scaling out beyond those houses that are interested into the wider element, you have to kind of take all of those things into consideration, and that helps to make it irresistible.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's right. I think we're really quite keen to like decentralize the storytelling as well now, and that's beginning to come through a lot more. And trying to tell the story not just of the human beings on the street, but of the nature as well on the street, and the seasons as well. And to try and, I mean, Andrea's film is just, the sense of place that comes through when you're watching that film is just amazing. Like the place is just such a character in the film. And we're really keen to try and trace that. And interestingly, there's more of us in the filmmaking role. It's not like me. There's Hilary as well, who's in it. Then we've got a little team developing now. And actually, some of the team members are just going out on the street and doing interviews. So it's almost like we're becoming, it's no longer such an authored film, because if you look at the earlier films that Hilary and I made, they ended up being quite authored, where you get a sort of a view through, I mean, that is, most filmmaking is a kind of view of nature, or the world through the prism of one person's, viewpoint. But actually, with a lot of these, what's interesting about these stories is that actually we're trying to create multifaceted stories, and this power station is just we're beginning to see a different approach, which I really like, and I like actually sort of becoming like less central to the narrative, although in that little teaser I'm probably still in there a bit. But yeah, the diversity of voices is becoming much more interesting. So there's definitely a different flavour beginning to come through, which is really good. I'm not sure if that answers your question or...
No, it does, because I think, do you have anything you want to add to that? No, because I think...
What's that? No. I just thought that you could talk maybe about the sense of place that you put into your film, because that the estate itself was such an integral kind of character in it. And I did see a few shots of you in the film, but there was never, it felt to me like there was a sort of equality in the amount of time that you spent with almost each different character.
I think for me it's always really been important to tell stories with, and also to, because I come from such a weird narrative, like my own journey has been so strange, and difficult, when I was younger, and the stories that were told about people like me were so unrecognizable to what I am, and I felt like I don't understand, and so it was always and because I work a lot in what's marginalized by structures, places, in all my films actually, there's never one meaning. I'm very aware that there's never one meaning, but there is a meaning that is against power. I think there is a rebelliousness and a fire, almost like a refusal to be reduced to a charitable case, or being reduced to somebody in need of help and support. Yes, people do need help and support, but not on the terms that are offered. And this is, I think, for me, the bigger question around the structures that are making invisible, or the imaginaries that we could make visible if there was a different world, when we would have a much better world, is also how do we really address these financialized structures, how do we insert ourselves and redistribute in a way that actually we have a different world. It's also about redistribution, but that means it's also about understanding and cooperation between these different knowledge systems, right? So, and it's for me less about, some films are driven by you and Hilary in a way that I think is it's quite lovely, because it anchors on you as characters, right? So for me, you're not you, but you're also a character in the work. And that works also. Like, I don't think there's just one way of telling a story about community. You know, that's your story, but then maybe if there's more money coming in, then other people will tell their own stories in other ways. So it's for me much more the idea of how do we hack these systems of power, and how do we actually reimagine even the possibility of thriving together and not erasing a voice, not saying like, oh, you have to do it like this, away from policing, like it's even the imagination, right? Like proper thriving and being creative in the face of power, but also understanding how we could redistribute, and how we can hold accountable, because I think, so Natalie Diaz talks a lot about accountability, and how accountability means also I'm accountable to you and you're accountable to me, but I also come and turn up. You know, I count, you count. And if you have like a reframing, of these kind of principles of like how we allow each other to be and really properly exist, rather than always saying, no, it should be like this, should be like this, or maybe I can't be in the film, I can't be. No, there should be no policing of creativity, but it should be, we should enable multiple voices and dissident voices to exist fully.
What I'm hearing is, in that building, that infrastructure where people can begin to imagine themselves as part of that new future, you have to create the space. And also, there's also that contradiction of, whilst you're doing that, acknowledging that there are certain systems that are working against the work that you're essentially doing, but not hiding or shying away from that, recognizing that, facing that, but still creating this other space where you can manifest this new imaginary in a very tangible and real way. And that's what I find really incredible, because we have this financial system, we have a system of regeneration that's affecting a lot of these areas and creating incredible displacement, whether that's physical or feeling displaced from the environment because you can't see your space in it. And so having, even in the role of a creative, as a filmmaker, you're kind of creating that platform where you can, you can belong here, you can envision here, you can act from here, and we can share our story on our own terms, which, something that sort of really struck me with the two films. I just wanted to kind of like hear your reflections on your response to that.
Not turning the other way around. But I think in Estate, as in my subsequent work, and prior to that as well, but in Estate, what I try to do is really explore what is home, you know, and because many of us in the film also didn't have necessarily a conventional idea of home, or have left home to go to a very different place. And home often is seen as just a dwelling, right? But it's not, it's so much more than that. Home is also like, who's around you, how can you be visible, how can you be seen and how you're unseen. And on the Estate, like the kind of neo-Georgian flatted dwellings, which were these red brick 4-story estates, of which there are like 152 left now in the UK only. But they had like an open architecture, which meant that at the landings you would pass by other people's kitchen windows and you could look into the courtyard. So you would see each other spatially. Instead of being excluded, like anyone here lives, like I live now in a building, we have a security fob. It's all architecturally designed not to see people. So it's as if you don't want to really live in a city, but in the countryside, I don't know, something like this. But these old places were made for people to see each other, which meant that people like Eric and John, who was playing the harmonica on the landing, they were visible every day. They were sitting outside, either playing music or just sitting. Everyone says, hello, 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 hello. And so when I started making this film, I was the one as a filmmaker then who entered everybody's place. But people didn't enter each other's place necessarily, because often people also wanted to have their privacy. But the film kind of became an invitation to share something of their lives. So they used me also, they used the space of the film to share something which they knew then would be held precious, you know, and with confidence that I would show them the film before it would be made public, and everybody had the right to review the footage. And it became like a shared moment of self-representation. And For example, with John, who had Parkinson's, there were 2 Johns in the film, but John who had the Parkinson's, when I showed him the footage, I took out quite a lot of when he had the dyskinesia, and he said, why is that not in the footage you're showing me? And I said, oh, because it's going to go public, and it shows you quite vulnerable, and maybe you want to keep that part private. And he said, I want this in the film because I want to have a space where I can show people what I go through, so other people who will go through this and have nobody and have no family know they're not alone. And he then also many of the people came to a lot of the screenings, so the film also became a space for people to put themselves into, which was very powerful for me to experience. That for me is kind of collaborative making, but it's not just facilitation, it's also giving beauty to something. I mean, that, like, as an artist, like, I think that was my role in that, but actually it was like a really shared, beautiful space.
That's really beautiful. Actually, yeah, that's triggered me to think that with the power station at the moment, we're like going around interviewing people on their doorsteps. So you get lots and lots of, what do you think about the energy crisis? Are you worried about the climate? And everyone on their doorstep, and it's sort of like montaging up. And then we held this kind of workshop where we showed them some historical footage of how the energy grid was built, very quickly against all instincts of a then conservative government who didn't want to invest in energy infrastructure, but they noticed that it was happening across Europe. And, our grid was like crazy. Anyway, so we showed them that, and then we also showed some of the footage that we'd already made of the film. And then it was really amazing because we started to ask them about the future, what they felt, and they all had these things. And at the end, we had this, it was kind of a room a bit like this. People just started getting up and just getting on the microphone and giving these long speeches, and we weren't used to, often it was, it was people that we'd had fairly monosyllabic conversations with in the past. Couldn't get them off the mic. I mean, they were literally just holding forth, about their hopes for what the power station would become, and they were all, many of them were saying, this is great. Now we really feel that we're standing up, and it's not me or Hilary, or it's all of us. We're all standing up. So it's a vehicle, actually, the film itself has become a vehicle to encapsulate the hopes that we all share, whether you live on the street or whether you live on the next street or wherever. And that's, I think, something that's quite missing from the day-to-day story. And again, that's an amazing thing that you did in the State. The overarching narrative of our times is not really an optimistic narrative. We're conditioned to hear negative news kind of day in, day out, and to kind of live with the fact that the system change that we require collectively is just not going to happen today or anytime soon. So if you can create a story which becomes that kind of vehicle for people to believe in and to take part in, you maybe design the story in such a way as to make it inclusive of, it's not sealed off, this is a microcosm story, for all of us, for our times. Then the story begins to belong to, thousands, maybe millions of people, because it's something that they don't have access to in the everyday run-of-the-mill narratives which are, encircling us.
It's also about fear, isn't it? Like that we are literally littered with the idea we have to be fearful of each other. There's big crime. These communities are this. My neighbor might be this. They might want this from us. Where actually we have to work against fear. I think fear has become one of the biggest weapons in this neoliberal society, or like the kind of decadence of our times now is also that fear and the security systems feed off that, not wanting to engage, not feeling you have the power to actually communicate with each other, or making spaces or creating spaces where you're heard because it's been shut down. So when there are spaces then for encounter across these different thresholds, they're the most beautiful and activating spaces. And you go like, how can we ever go back to not having that, right? And like on our estate, when that happened, there's been no return. Even like with all the kind of troubles that we have now, like there is still that. And that knowing and not shutting off is really, really super precious. And I think that's for me also, like, I think what intergenerational knowledge reproduction often has given, like the necessity of there's a space made for you now to thrive, right? But we have to make that space. And I think that these ideas about community doesn't just exist, community is a practice. And that comes from really like, it's a long tradition of that, especially within Black feminist practice. And I think in indigenous knowledge productions, like we were just talking about before, like these practices have also existed and we can really learn from them. We can learn from them as a society, and community organizing, we've had to do them, but many people don't necessarily have to do them because they might sit quite comfortably within the structures that we have. And sometimes you only get activated when you feel pushed out of these structures, when you're uncomfortable. So what kind of body are we when we feel cozy and comfortable when other people tell us they are not? And I think that's an activating force to say, okay, maybe we have to make a space because who is not yet on the table?
That's just making me think of a conversation that we aired on radio yesterday about historical precedents. Because we've been thinking about how can we show the people that a transition is possible by looking back at what has been. And so a key example for us at the moment is the NHS. With all its challenges, it was founded at a time when they went through a process of people not having much belief that it was possible or not believing that it was necessary. And you see this cumulative effect of people writing papers, of people campaigning, trying to influence policy that eventually results in the formation of the NHS, and the same with the Public Library Act in the 1850. So I think even when you look back and you see these incredible examples of how you bring people into that space of hope and then it permeates into policy, and definitely I see what we're doing as creating these networks of activists that eventually will have a cumulative effect if we look back at that. Are there any historic precedences that you look back to and draw from as you're kind of moving forward?
I'll do this one. Well, when we started making the film Up and Down the Street, first of all, just to say on that kind of fear, picking up that, we were scared of opening. Like I actually, although being in films and all the rest of it, I'm still really shy of like knocking on someone's door. So that was a real process that was hard for us. But once the doors were opened and the people popped out of their houses, a bit like like cuckoos or whatever from the Swiss clock or whatever, no one really went back in. From that, after that, we've become this kind of street community. There's so many things happening on the street. It's amazing. But in terms of like drawing back to inspirational times and connected to that, there was a lady that lived on the end of our street called Dorothy, who was 100, and she was one of the people whose doors we knocked on, and she remembered, that when she was a child, she grew up on the street basically, so she'd been there her whole life, and in her childhood there was no electric grid at all. So during her life, this entire fossil fuel heavy grid came into existence. And when you see that, just literally in one person's life cycle, this entire energy system has been built and is now sort of beginning to become unfit for purpose, you can also see, that new systems, actually it doesn't take that much for them to come into existence. And it does have to be, I suppose it has to start in the imagination. People have got to imagine what they want collectively before they decide to build it. So I don't know. I think the grid one is good, and we've basically assembled a lot of archive footage of the grid. And there was a really good BBC 4 documentary series about the history of the grid, which I guess it just shows. I mean, you literally have footage of people, going up and down, like hammering in all of the the posts and the wires and all the rest of it. So yeah, that's really my hope. I think it's about sort of winning the case for the imagination. That it, not only is it possible, it's absolutely necessary, and that it has to happen really quickly. And at the scale that is necessary. And I think that the history of the grid points towards the the future of the energy system, basically.
I mean, for me, it's. I mean, I had similar. Like, I think you said everything, but for us also, it was the idea of. I learned a lot from the people in the film because we made this home together, and it was the first time I had a safe, like a space which I knew I wasn't going to be moved on from. And people like Lorna in the film who said, we must never call the police if there's a problem, but we must fix it ourselves or figure out how to make it livable amongst ourselves. It was a really big thing for me because I grew up also with this idea of everything is dangerous because, you know, like my family comes from Eastern Europe and there was like so many spies and there was so much corruption, I guess, like also, and your neighbor might not be really the neighbor. And that way of thinking is, I think, what's so dangerous and why fear in this country of each other is we have to really guard against, and when you see it being implemented in other ways, but it is that kind of thing as well. So I learned from my neighbors a lot about trust, and a lot about making space and taking time to figure it out. Even if it's uncomfortable for yourself, you might not fix it the way you want it fixed, but it will be fixed so it suits people in some way and accommodates for people who might have a difficult time at that moment and cannot stop the music playing really loud for a few months. It's fine, we can survive that, right? I mean, it's really interesting when you just change the parameters of what's supposed to be then into what truly is livable. And then things become beautiful because suddenly I felt there was space for me too. And then, I could take space because there was space. And I want to just say lastly, like now, a new exhibition will open in the Aylesbury estate. It's called Fight for Aylesbury. And we learned a lot from Highgate Estate and Aylesbury Estate, which were the campaigns of how to resist the gentrification and trying to retrofit, but being unsuccessful. And demolition was inevitable. And we're talking about the early mid-2000s when the Highgate Estate happened. In our estate, we learned a lot from the campaign there in order to prevent that. So there was a lot of learning that happened before we had social media exchanges and before we could actually mobilize very fast. We had to do it like through other means. So I learned a lot from these people, and this last campaign, so the Fight for Aylesbury, will be in Ison Dennis's flat. She's one of the last remaining people who are going to be moved out, and she's an amazing, amazing campaigner for decades and decades, one of the most beautiful human beings. And there's going to be a trauma room, there's going to, for all the people who are exhausted by this work, and some people who have not made it because it's also an international component to it. And then there's the kind of memory room, and then there's her, you know, people are just talking. So it's also about having conversations with each other about hopes that might not have worked, but actually the memory of us all having fought together is important too. So Fight for Aylesbury, starting on the 17th of April.
Thank you. So in terms of turning the street into a power station, there's a lot of technical knowledge that you have to kind of share and bring people on board with. And also, I'm curious to know how you bring people into that conversation. And also, have you done mapping on how much energy you can produce? Have you created that kind of what will happen if we do this? Have you done that with Neighbourhood? Because
Oh my God, technical one. Sarah here we're kind of collaborating a bit with you, aren't we? From HEAL, Home Energy Action Lab. Did I get it right? Oh my God, thank God for that. So what we do, like our method is we've got a membership site where people join in and we basically, anything that we don't understand or know ourselves, we just get an expert to come and try and explain it. So in that way, Sarah, this question's for you. No, so in that way, we've developed a working knowledge of how solar works, I guess, up to a point. I can't remember how many kilowatts or whatever we'll make collectively. But we're also working with 5 or 6 schools across the borough as well. So we have been mapping out a bit of how many tons of carbon we will save once everything's in place. But I couldn't tell you. It is like something like 50,000 tons of carbon a year across all the different things that we're building. But not one solar panel has yet gone up, I have to stress. So it's not yet in place. But we're trying to also work out how we can insulate houses. And that's hopefully where Sarah will somehow forge a collaboration, because you're such a passionate architect of retrofit and more. But I don't know, I can't really welcome Sarah to the stage to talk about that, can I? Or could we?
We could, and we could also welcome Charlie to the stage, because this is where Charlie comes in
Yeah,
Civic
there we
Square.
go,
So
look.
welcome to the stage for the last 10 minutes.
Yeah, why not?
It's almost like this looks like we planned this. We definitely didn't plan this. I'll come and sit beside you. There is a solar heat potential map of London, and there is a heat potential map of London being built. So anybody who's interested in that data, that is coming.
Yeah, what did you want us to talk about? Oh, okay. Yeah, so I guess the relevance to what we're doing is if you look over on that table over there, right behind Magda, you'll see the sort of what is and what if framing is a big part of how we've approached a similar kind of project on Link Road. So one of the cards, for example, says there is the potential for, I think, 150,000 kilowatt hours of solar energy on the rooftops of Link Road. And similar to what you were saying about, getting people to cuckoo out of their doors, using these sort of cards and connecting the what is of the data on the street to the what if of like, okay, well, if that's there, then what? Was a really big part of how we've been doing similar kind of work. So it's always fascinating to hear about basically the same kind of strategy and language and approach and collective action happening all over the place.
I think the thing that we're trying to do, and by we I mean Home Energy Action Lab, but also Architects Climate Action Network, there's lots of people, lots of human energy going into this sort of exploration of this space of what we've sort of started to talk about as landing and expanding these ideas that happen, and being able to like demystify those processes and share them and replicate them because of the latent power and energy within communities everywhere, that as you start to look just left and right of you, you see that's a reality, that community bit. And I think the bit I'd just like to share with people is that, the work that Dan and Hilary are doing, the work that's happening in Link Road, the work that's happening in Balsall Heath, there are lots of these pockets. This movement exists. It exists, as lots of people have already said, that exists. And if we have a role to play with connections into other levers to see that delivered at scale, then the work that we do is trying to unlock that potential for just sharing that and amplifying that work as far and wide as we can so that others can pick it up.
I think that listening to that, unlocking the human potential within the neighbourhood, that's something that really made me rethink even my practice when I was kind of graduating. Where's Deanna? She's disappeared. But because looking at Andrea's film, it showed me that you can bring people together if you create a platform, and you can unlock this collective power. And so we can have this systemic transformation, but it starts with people. So what I think is holding at the forefront of our mind, and the North Star almost, is how do we create spaces where people can see themselves as part of that transition, and people can see themselves as part of the future, and makers and creators of the future, and creators of the new urban imaginary. So that's what I'm thinking. That's where I kind of saw this Powell panel coming together, because we have that one about bringing people together at the end of the life of a place and experiencing this displacement, met with this incredible empowerment of people coming together and saying, well, let's make our own energy and maybe sell it back to the grid if we want to do that. I don't know. So I think that's what's really quite key in this conversation for me. And I kind of want to just pass the mic around, final points, so we can wrap the conversation up. Do you want to start, Andrea?
For me, the question is, how do we how do we get access to the big power? How can we disrupt the big power together? Yeah.
That's right, isn't it? It is together, those words. And I think, for me, the great work that filmmakers like you both do is just focus our attention in a place where we've been told not to look. So we've been told not to look in communities for change or ability or that. And I think actually, if we look away from the lens, the big scary top-down lens saying everything is awful and we're all doomed, if you look away from that and look in a different way, there's actually immense beauty, power, potential for a thriving future. And I think that's what we all have an obligation. Those of us who can choose to look that way should look that way.
I'll just try and finish on a quote from David Graeber that I really like. He said, protest is like asking the powers that be if you can have a well. Direct action is building a well and daring them to stop you. And I think that's where we need to be. That's what we should be doing, just building lots and lots of wells.
Yeah, I appreciate a little anarchist closure to the panel. I think for me, the way that you put it, Sarah, in leverage is the way I'm trying to think about things. So, yeah, any systemic change that I think we've seen in the last 100 or so years hasn't really come from a centrally motivated place. The weekend came from unions, the NHS came from a worker cooperative that then got campaigned into the NHS. So I think the reason why despite maybe a lack of inspirational central government leadership in any direction, the reason why I'm still optimistic about the kind of work we're doing is that historically, none of the momentum's really come from there anyway. So, yeah, I think it's just more motivation to keep the energy going in this kind of grassroots direction.
And I think something I just want to finish with is when we're looking at transition, we have to look at it as nested scales. So you have that bigger power structure, and then you have the power that we embody and that once we recognize and bring to the table, we also have to acknowledge that we then still have to interact with that greater power. So not being idealistic and not having rose-tinted glasses about it. We still have to get to that point. But I think when we create this incredible network, which we have, and we build and we recognize and honor that, we'll be in a much better place to do that. But we have to do it really quickly. It's happening, yeah.